In the next couple of videos, we're going to take a look at the concepts of validity, soundness, strength, and cogency. And these are the most important concepts that we're going to be covering in this course, insofar as we're logicians. And that is especially true of validity and strength. And the reason why that's true for validity and strength is because they track the notion of truth preservation that I've already discussed. So let me give you a quick rehash or review of truth preservation. If you'll recall, we have discussed a few different components of arguments. So one of our components is the factual claim, which involves the premises that make up one part of the argument. So that's one component: the factual claim or the premises, the evidence, the support, etc. The next thing is the conclusion, what we're trying to establish or convince somebody of. And that's another part of argumentation. And what's nice is in most arguments, you know, they're either said out aloud or written down. And so these components have physical manifestations, and it's very easy for us to get our heads around them. And we can ask ourselves whether we think they're plausible, whether they're true or false. But that's not so much these aren't so much the components that we're worried about, or at least not what we want to focus our attention on. As logicians, we want to focus our attention on this other component of an argument, in which implicitly, when we give an argument, we say, because these premises are true, right? So I give you these premises and I'm telling you should take them to be true. Maybe I'm wrong about whether they're true or false, but I'm saying, look, you should take these to be true. And because of them being true, you should also accept the conclusion to be true. And this is the inferential move. The inference in that first sense I had talked about. And in the same way that a premise could be good or bad because it could be true or false, an inference can be good or bad because it could be one where our reasoning process was truth preserving. It actually, if these premises turn out to be true, it's the kind of argument that would take that truth and would in fact carry it into the conclusion. Or it can be non-truth preserving, in which case, even if the premises are true, the conclusion could still turn out to be false, or it could be more likely to be false than true. All right, so that's our notion. That picks up on our notion of truth preservation, and this is what we're focusing on. We want to see whether the argument is good or bad because we want to know whether the inference is good or bad. We want to know whether the inference was truth preserving or not truth preserving. And validity and strength are going to be our corresponding concepts to truth preservation. Validity has to do with when we're dealing with deductive arguments. Strength has to do when we're dealing with inductive arguments. So a valid argument is a deductive argument that is truth preserving, and a strong argument is an inductive argument that's truth preserving. The truth preserving is different in these cases in that a valid argument preserves that truth 100% if it's a valid argument. An inductive argument preserves the truth greater than a 50% chance and less than a 100% chance, so somewhere in between there. And then soundness and cogency is a second level for arguments to be good. So validity and strength, this is the first level in which arguments can be good. Namely, they're truth preserving. Soundness and cogency is a second way. Soundness, again, is going to deal with our deductive arguments. It's truth preserving, that is, it's valid, and its premises are in fact true. So it's not just, so first we were looking to see if the premises are true, would the conclusion have to be true? Now we're saying, yes, that's right, for a sound argument. And not only that, but the premises are true, which for a sound argument, that means the conclusion is going to have to be true. Our notion of cogency is going to have to deal, or is going to deal with inductive arguments. And again, we do have a truth-preserving argument. So if the premises are true, because of the truth of those premises, the conclusion is going to have to be more probable than not, and the premises are in fact true. So we're going to look at these concepts in more detail. This first video, we're going to explore validity and soundness in more detail, and then we'll turn our attention to strength and cogency. Before moving on and talking about the concepts of validity and soundness in more detail, I wanted to map out a little bit of where we've been and where we're going. So if you'll recall, we worked our way from a set of statements to defining an argument as a structured set of statements that reflects an inference, and we distinguished arguments from non-arguments, and outside of being able to determine arguments apart from non-arguments, we're not going to be all that concerned with non-arguments. Then there's two kinds of arguments. There's deductive arguments and there's inductive arguments, and we spent time being able to identify which one is deductive and which one is inductive. So you'll see then as we continue, the concepts of validity and soundness pertain to the deductive side of arguments. So a deductive argument can be valid, as we said, that it can be truth-preserving, or it can be invalid, in which case it's not truth-preserving. So this is one level of goodness. If an argument is valid, that's one level of goodness. If it's invalid, that's one level of badness. Now, if an argument is valid, it has a chance of being sound. If it's invalid, automatically goes to being unsound. But if it's valid, it has a chance of being sound. And soundness, an argument being sound, is a second way of an argument being good. It's even better than being valid because it includes validity. But a valid argument can also be unsound. And now we're going to give more treatment, a more thorough treatment to validity and soundness. The first step in deciding whether a deductive argument is good or bad is to determine whether it's deductively valid. So determine whether it's a valid argument or an invalid argument. So we need to know what the definition of validity is. And we say that an argument is deductively valid just in case, if its premises are true, then its conclusion must be true. And it's important to stress that this is in the context of a conditional statement. It's not saying that the premises are true. It's saying that if its premises are true, that is, if they were to be true, then its conclusion must be true. There's no case in which the conclusion could be false. All those circumstances are being excluded by the premises of the argument. So an argument is deductively valid just in case, if its premises are true, then its conclusion must be true. There's no way for it to be false. So there's another way of stating this definition of validity that doesn't have it as a conditional statement, and I think the conditional statement sometimes throws students off. So the other standard textbook definition of validity is an argument is deductively valid just in case the argument cannot have both all true premises and a false conclusion. It couldn't be the case that all of its premises turn out to be true, but his conclusion ends up being false. That's an impossibility. All right, so that's the definition of validity, and you'll probably hear me bring that up time and time again. So let's turn to taking that definition of validity and then thinking about how we can apply that to cases of deductive arguments and deciding whether it's a valid argument or an invalid argument. The process for checking whether an argument is valid or invalid can be broken down into 4 steps. And it's worth stressing that when we're checking for validity, we're not checking to see whether the premises or the conclusions or the conclusion is true. So we're not checking to see whether the premises are true, and we're not checking to see whether the conclusion is true. Keep in mind, our concept of validity is not the same thing as the concept of truth. Validity, instead, it has to do with truth preservation. If the premises are true, not whether they are true, but if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So we're looking to see if our argument satisfies that definition. So when determining whether an argument satisfies that definition, it's best to first ignore whether the premises are in reality true or false. Just take that off the table. Instead, we're going to pretend that the premises are true. So we ignore factually whether in the world around us, really in the world around us, whether the premises are true or false. Instead, we just go ahead and pretend that they are true. And then while pretending that the premises are true, we want to ask whether a set of circumstances could make the conclusion false. So let's consider a very simple example. Say we have, if it rains outside, then the grass is wet. So that's our first premise. Our second premise, the grass is wet. Therefore, it rained outside. And many people will think that this argument is a good argument, but it's not. It's not a truth-preserving argument. Why? Because I can dream up a circumstance in which the premises are true, but the conclusion is false. So it can't be a truth-preserving argument if the premises really are true, yet the conclusion could be false. So think of the circumstance in which the grass is in fact wet, but not because it rained. It didn't actually rain. It's because I was watering the lawn with the sprinkler. Okay. It would still be true that if it rained, then the grass would be wet because it rains water. Water is wet. So if it rains outside, the grass is going to get wet. So that would be true even though it didn't actually turn out, even though it didn't rain in the scenario that I'm talking about, that I am imagining and I've dreamt up. But the grass is still wet, right? In this case, it's wet because of a water sprinkler, because I'm watering the lawn. But it's false. The conclusion is false that it rained outside. It didn't, right? It didn't under the circumstance I just dreamt up. So this ends up being true. Yet our conclusion ends up being false. Well, clearly the argument isn't truth preserving if our conclusion can be false even though our premises are true. So we didn't get the truth preserved in this case. So then we ask ourselves, if I can dream up a kind of circumstance, if it's possible for me to dream up a circumstance in which the premises turn out to be true but the conclusion is false, then the argument's invalid. It doesn't preserve the truth. But if it's impossible to dream up such a scenario, such a circumstance in which the premises are true but the conclusion is false, then the argument is valid. The conclusion is going to have to be true if those premises turned out to be true, and of course that satisfies the definition of validity, so the argument would be valid. So now let's apply this process for checking for validity to some arguments. So in this box to the left, we have the argument, all humans are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is mortal. Therefore, Socrates is a human. So go ahead and pause the video and take a moment to decide whether you think that argument is a valid argument or an invalid argument. All right, if you maintain that the argument is invalid, good. Now, many students are likely to maintain that it's a valid argument, or it's a truth-preserving argument when it's not. And part of the reason for that is the confusing truth, the truth of the concrete components as being what determines whether the argument is valid or invalid. So all humans are mortal, turns out that's true. Socrates is mortal if we ignore, and let's go ahead and ignore for the moment past tense and present tense and allow that to be true. Therefore, Socrates is a human, again ignoring past and present, the difference between past and present tense. That's going to be true. And as a result, many students are going to think, well, okay, that's a valid argument. All the components that I can visually see here end up being true, so it's got to be a good argument. But it's not, because there could be a circumstance, given all the information that we have in premise 1, in the premises, it could turn out that Socrates is, say, a raccoon. So say Socrates picks out a raccoon. In that case, we could just substitute out Socrates for raccoon wherever we see Socrates. And we ask ourselves, okay, premise 1, all humans are mortal. That's still true, right? All humans are mortal. Unfortunate for us, we are going to die at some point. Raccoons are mortal, or a raccoon is mortal. Yep, that's true. Turns out unfortunately for raccoons, all of them are going to perish at some point. Therefore, raccoons are humans. That's false. Okay? This is no longer true under this substitution instance. So I was able to dream up a circumstance in which we got all true premises but a false conclusion. And that tells us that the argument isn't truth preserving. The structure of the argument isn't good. And so just because it is in fact true that all humans are mortal, and it's in fact true that Socrates was mortal, that's not going to be good enough reason. That's not enough information and reason to be convinced that Socrates is a human. You happen to already know that Socrates is a human, so many students end up being misled to think that it's a good argument, but it's clearly not a truth-preserving argument, so it's not a valid argument, it is invalid. So now let's look at this argument that we have here in this red box to the right. So P1, if the grass is green, then the moon is made of blue cheese. The grass is green, therefore the moon is made of blue cheese. So go ahead and pause the video and take a moment to determine whether this is a valid argument or an invalid argument. All right, if you said this is a valid argument, good. It is in fact a valid argument. Many students, however, are inclined to think that it's an invalid argument. And the main reason why is because they'll notice that this ridiculous premise here is false. Turns out the grass is green. If I look out my window, turns out that the antecedent is true. But we have sent people to the moon, and when they got there, they did not find blue cheese. So the consequent is false. So that means this premise has to be false, because it tells what it asserts is that if the grass is green, it's going to happen, it's going to be the case that the moon is made out of blue cheese. Well, the grass really is green, but it's not the case that the moon is made out of blue cheese. So what it is asserting is false. Again, the grass is green is in fact true. And our conclusion, the moon is made of blue cheese, is false. So many students, because we have these false components, this false premise and this false conclusion, many students are inclined to think that this is going to be an invalid argument. But remember, in validity, our concept of validity isn't going to be determined by the truth of the premises or the falseness of the premises, nor the truth of the conclusion or the falseness of the conclusion. Instead, it's a matter of whether, if the premises were true, if the conclusion must be true. So if we pretend for a moment that premise 1 is true, that if the grass is green, then the moon is made of blue cheese. So it's saying that the grass being green is going to guarantee that the moon is made of blue cheese, and then we find out that the grass is green, right? That's what our second premise tells us. We fulfill that condition that's going to guarantee that the moon is made of blue cheese. So if premise 1 and premise 2 end up being true, if they were true, it would have to be the case that the moon is made of blue cheese. And there's no way for it to not be made of blue cheese given premise 1 and premise 2 is true. So that satisfies our definition of validity, and that argument is valid even though it has a false premise and a false conclusion. Before moving on to soundness, the concept of soundness, let's talk about the importance of validity in just a little bit more detail. So as I've been maintaining, if a deductive argument is valid, that tells us that the deductive argument is truth-preserving. It has the property of being truth-preserving. And for that reason, that means the argument has a chance of being convincing. So think about an argument that doesn't have that truth-preserving element. When we go up to somebody and we offer an argument, we state the reasons, and implicitly we're saying, because these premises are true, at least I'm maintaining that they're true, because these premises are true, you should accept the conclusion to be true. But if an argument is not truth-preserving, then what that means is that the conclusion could be false, even though the premises are true. So if you're lacking that truth-preserving element, there's no reason for you to be convinced of it. It doesn't have a way of being convincing, because let's just grant that the premises are true. For all the truth of the premises, the conclusion could still turn out to be false. So why accept the conclusion based on an argument in which it could still be false for all the information that you've been given? The third reason why validity is important is because it gives us a certain framework of rules in which to argue. Namely, if you accept the premises of a valid argument, then unless you're irrational, you have to accept the conclusion to be true. Why? Because the definition of validity is if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So if you accept the premises to be true, and you understand that it's a valid argument and what we mean by a valid argument, then you had better accept the conclusion to be true, or you're in a position where you deny the conclusion, you maintain that it's false, even though you at the same time understand that it's true. So now you're maintaining it's both true and false. That's inconsistent. That's a contradiction, and contradictions don't happen. The other thing that a valid argument forces you to do then is, if you're presented with a valid argument, and suppose that it's arguing for a conclusion that you think is false, then you'll have to deny one of the premises. And so now you owe the person who gave you the argument an explanation for why that person should believe one of the premises that they have offered to be false instead of true. So you give a valid argument, you're presented with a valid argument, you're now stuck between, rationally, if you're a rational person, you're stuck between two possibilities. You either are going to have to accept the conclusion, or you're going to have to deny one of the premises. I guess the third option is maybe you just don't even care one way or the other, so you don't even bother. But insofar as you care about the argument and engaging in the argument, you're stuck between, if you're presented with a valid argument, you're stuck with either denying one of the premises or accepting the conclusion. All right, let's turn our attention to soundness. So with the concept of soundness, it's an extra step of being good, of being a good argument, than validity. So validity is one way in which an argument is good, namely it's truth-preserving. A sound argument is truth-preserving, and it has all true premises. So as our textbook definition that we have listed here in front of us, an argument is deductively sound just in case it is both valid and has all true premises. So both of these conditions, being valid and having all true premises, must be satisfied in order for the argument to be a sound argument. So as I have found this image here on Google, we see that soundness occurs in the overlap between truth, and this should say truth premises, and when the argument is valid. So you get those, you get a sound argument. So based on that definition, then we can formulate a way for checking to see whether an argument is sound or whether it's unsound. First, we ask whether the argument is valid, and we just go back to the very same process that I've already gave you to check for validity. So you go through that process, determine whether the argument is valid or invalid. If it is valid, then we continue on to the third step. If it's not, then we already know that it's unsound. We don't have to go any further. All right, so if we do end up saying yes, then it satisfies one of our conditions, namely that it's valid. But now we stop pretending that the premises are true. Right, when we were checking for validity, we said, well, let's, for the moment, pretend that these premises are true, independent of whether they really are false or true. So instead of pretending, now we ask whether in reality, whether actually the premises are true. And if we find out that all of its premises are true, then congratulations, we have a sound argument. And if we say no, then it's an unsound argument. So if we find out that one of the premises is false, then it ends up being an unsound argument. So let's turn to looking at some, applying this procedure to some arguments. All right, so we have an argument here. First premise says, if Bush is the president, then the president is a Republican. Premise 2, Bush is the president. Therefore, the president is a Republican. So I want you to take the procedure that we just discussed and apply it to this argument and determine whether you think it's sound or unsound. So remember, first determine whether it's valid or invalid, and then determine whether it's sound or unsound. And I'll let you pause the video and take a little bit of time to determine that. If you maintain that the argument is unsound, good for you. Many people that I've seen will sometimes say that the argument is sound because they forget that George W. Bush no longer is the President of the United States. So it is true that if he were the president, so if Bush is the president, then the president is a Republican. That's true. But as it stands, Mr. Bush is no longer the president of the United States. So when you're judging the validity of the argument, we see that this maintains Bush being the president would guarantee that the president is a Republican. And our second premise satisfies this first condition. So if premise 1 is true, if it were to be true, then because we're told that premise 2, we're asserted that it's true, it would have to be that the president is a Republican. So it satisfies the question of validity. It is a valid argument. But then when we go on to check the other condition, right, there's 2 conditions for an argument to be sound. It's got to be valid, so it meets that condition. But it's got to have all true premises, but it doesn't. It has a false premise, and so it's an unsound argument. So the following argument, we have premise 1, if Obama is the president, then the president is a Democrat. Premise 2, the president is a Democrat. Conclusion, therefore, Obama is the president. So again, we're checking to see whether this argument is sound or unsound. Go ahead and pause the video, take a little bit of time to determine whether you think it's sound or unsound. Okay, if you said that this argument is unsound, good for you. One of the problems that students will have, they'll maintain that this is a sound argument, because our premises and our conclusion are at the moment true. It is true that if Obama is the president, then the president is a Democrat, and that's true because Obama turns out to be a Democrat. It is true that the president is a Democrat, because Obama is in fact the president at the moment, and he is in fact a Democrat. And it's even true that Obama is the president. But it's still an unsound argument, because for soundness, we need not only all of our premises to be true, we need the argument to be valid. But this argument fails at being valid. So we can see this in a couple of different ways. One is if we look at what this premise asserts. It asserts that Obama being the president, that obtaining will guarantee that the president is a Democrat. So that's what that this premise asserts to be true. It doesn't assert the antecedent to be true. It doesn't assert the consequent to be true. It asserts that if the antecedent obtains, you're also going to get the consequent. The consequent is also going to obtain. Notice that runs in one direction. That runs in the direction of you get the antecedent, then you get the consequent. But our second premise is not the antecedent. It's the consequent, right? It's what follows the then statement here. But this doesn't assert, our first premise does not assert if the president is a Democrat, then Obama is the president. And so just because these both are true, it won't guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So it's not truth preserving, and even though this happens to be true at the moment. The other way to see that we have an invalid argument is to note that we can make a circumstance could obtain where our premises are true but our conclusion is false. So suppose here after, well, I guess it has to be longer than after November 8th, but suppose Hillary Clinton gets sworn in as the President of the United States. Notice that, so let's have that HC. So this is the circumstance in which Hillary Clinton ends up winning the presidency and is sworn in. Notice that it'll still be true that if Obama is the president, then the president is a Democrat. Even though he's no longer the president, it's still true that if he were, the president would be a Democrat. Notice that because Hillary Clinton is a Democrat, under this circumstance, premise 2 will be true. But even though premise 1 would be true and premise 2 would be true, under this scenario, it's going to turn out that Obama is not the president, so the conclusion would be false. So the argument can't be truth-preserving if it's possible for the premises to be true, but the conclusion to be false. So it's an invalid argument, and since a sound argument needs to be both valid and have all true premises, it's an unsound argument. It got all the true premises, but it failed to be a valid. It failed the other condition of being a valid argument. So now let's determine whether this argument is sound or unsound. Its first premise says, if it rains, can't see, here we go. If it rains down on the ground, right on the ground, then the ground here is now wet. It is not the case that the ground here is now wet. I am touching it, and you're just going to have to trust me that it is in fact not wet. Therefore, it is not the case that it rains here on the ground now. So premise 1, by the way that I stipulated its meaning, is going to have to be true, and premise 2 is also going to have to be true. So for this argument, I've already cashed it out in a way that it satisfies one of the conditions of soundness. It guarantees that all of the premises of the argument, all of those premises end up being true. So now pause the video and decide whether you think it satisfies the other condition and therefore is a sound argument or an unsound argument. If you maintain that it's a sound argument, then you're correct, because it ends up being a valid argument. And this might be difficult for some of us to see right out at first, but if we look at premise 1, it says if it rains on the ground now, then the ground here is now wet. Our second premise tells us that it's not the case. That's what this, I'm going to let this symbol mean. It's not the case that the ground here is now wet. So it's false that it's wet, that the ground here is now wet. Notice that what our first premise says then is, if this was to be satisfied, if it rains here on the ground now, that's going to guarantee that the ground here is now wet. So then it's also true that the ground here isn't wet. Well, it better not be the case that it rained, because then we would have premise 2, which tells us that the ground isn't wet, and on the condition that it did rain, we would be guaranteed that the ground is wet. But this is a contradiction. This says of the ground that it's both wet and not wet at the same time in the same place, and contradictions just can't happen. It's not possible for it to happen. So since it raining here on the ground is going to guarantee that the ground here now is wet, and because it in fact isn't the case that the ground here is now wet, it's got to be the case that it did not rain here on the ground now. And that's just what our conclusion states. It is not the case that it rains here on the ground now. So we satisfy one condition, all of our premises are true. We satisfy this demonstration up here was to show that it satisfied the other condition, which is that the argument in question is valid. And since it satisfies both of those conditions, we do in fact have a sound argument. So what's important about this concept of soundness? The main significance about an argument being sound is if a person understands what's meant by sound, then that person, if rational, must accept the conclusion. Why? Why must that be? Well, one component of a sound argument is that it's a valid argument. So remember what the definition of validity is. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. The second component of a sound argument is that the premises are all true. So if the definition of a valid argument is if the premises are true, its conclusion must be true, and it has all true premises, it follows that the conclusion of a sound argument is always true. That's why a rational audience member must accept the conclusion. The conclusion of a sound argument will be true. So let's turn our attention to a couple more arguments to decide whether it's valid and whether it's sound using the processes that we discussed earlier. So the argument here says that if Rhode Island is a small island in the South Pacific, so let's go ahead and call that R, then it is smaller than Texas. Then it is smaller than Texas. Let's call that S. Then what we're told is that Rhode Island is not a small island in the South Pacific. So in other words, what premise 2 tells us is that the antecedent to premise 1 doesn't obtain. And so we're told because of premise 1 and premise 2, it's got to be the case that Rhode Island is not smaller than Texas. So R leads to S. R happening guarantees that S happens. You don't get R, therefore you don't get S. So take a moment and consider whether you think this argument is valid or invalid, or sound or unsound. So many of you are going to be inclined to think that this is a valid argument. And this is called denying the antecedent, and it's a standard case of a fallacy. So it's not a valid argument, it's invalid. And the reason why is just because it turns out that it's false that Rhode Island is not even though it turns out that it's false that Rhode Island is a small island in the South Pacific, that is, we don't get the antecedent here. Well, there could be other reasons. It could still be the case that Rhode Island is smaller than Texas for some other reason, right? Namely, it's a small state in New England. So even if these are true, this could turn out to be false. Rhode Island is not smaller than Texas. Now, if you didn't follow that, it might be easier to think of cases, and another case that is similar to one that we've already talked about. So if it rains outside, then the grass is wet. So then let's say we don't get the antecedent again. So it turns out that it didn't rain outside. And then from this, we make the inference that that the grass is not wet. The problem is that it could be that I watered my yard with a sprinkler. So let it be true, take a circumstance in which it ends up being true, that it doesn't rain outside. Even though it's true that it doesn't rain outside, notice that it's true that if it were to have rained, if it had rained outside, then the grass outside would be wet. So that's true even though it doesn't actually rain outside. This says the grass isn't wet, but I watered it. I watered it with a water sprinkler. So it is in fact wet, which means the conclusion is false because it says it isn't wet. So just because these are true, it doesn't guarantee that the conclusion is true. It can be false. And this is just the same structure that we have up here. So that tells us that the argument in question is an invalid argument. And if we think about then the definition of a sound argument, it's one in which all of its premises need to be true and the conclusion, all the premises are true, and it's also a valid argument. Well, since this is an invalid argument, it doesn't satisfy one of the conditions that's needed, and so it is an unsound argument. So it's neither valid nor is it sound. All right, again, let's check to see whether this argument is valid and whether it's sound. So it says all wines are beverages. Chardonnay is a wine, or all instances of Chardonnay are instances of wine. Therefore, Chardonnay is a beverage. So go ahead and pause the video. Take a moment to decide whether you think it's a valid argument or invalid, and then determine whether you think it's a sound argument or an unsound argument. Okay, if you said this is a valid argument, you're right. So in our first premise, when it says all wines are beverages, we're told that we have a category, it's supposed to be a circle, but we have the category of beverages, and we're told that anything that ends up being wine is going to fit completely inside of the category of beverages. Of course, there's going to be other things than wine, it turns out, but everything that is a wine is going to end up being within the category of beverages. Then we're told that Chardonnay, so all instances of Chardonnay are instances of wine. So everything that's a Chardonnay is fully within the category of things that are wine. Our conclusion says that Chardonnay is a beverage, and notice that since Chardonnay, we've claimed, is fully within the category of wine, and the wine is fully within the category of beverages, it's got to be the case that the category of Chardonnay is fully within the category of beverages. So if premise 1 and premise 2 were true, if they turn out to be true, then this conclusion has to be true. So we have a valid argument that satisfies our definition of validity. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. The next question then is whether the premises are in fact true, because our definition of soundness is one in which an argument is valid and has all true premises. So we got the valid component, but we still need to determine whether it gets all the premises to be true. So our first premise is all wines are beverages. I think that's true. You might think of one exception. So maybe cooking wines aren't also beverages. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure whether cooking wines should be considered to be beverages or not beverages. I am going to, for the purpose of this example, stipulate that they are beverages. But if you think I'm wrong, that's fine. And if I'm wrong, this ends up being an unsound argument because we would have a false premise. But let's say I turn out to be right and all wines are beverages. It turns out that Chardonnays are instances of wine, and that is always true just by what is meant by Chardonnay. So then we would have a valid argument, we would have all true premises, and this argument would be a sound argument. So according to my interpretation of cooking wines, this is a sound argument. So before turning to the concepts of strength and cogency, we need to take a little bit deeper look at disjunctions. So you'll recall that disjunctions are these either-or statements. So I have here in the abstract either A or B. And you can just imagine, for our purposes, just as I'm explaining this part, that this is either the grass is green or the snow is white. So that's the statement. And there's two senses that these either-or statements can take. There's two meanings that they can take. One meaning is the exclusive sense, and another meaning is the inclusive sense. And when we say disjunctions in the exclusive sense, what we're saying is this statement is true, either the grass is green or the snow is white, is true only if and only in one of these two cases. So if it turns out that the grass is green, but the snow is yellow, then the grass is green or the snow is white ends up being true. Or if the situation turns out that the snow is white but the grass is brown, then our statement that the grass is green or the snow is white will again be true. It'll be false in two cases. It'll be false in the case in which the grass is brown and the snow is yellow. And not only that, but it'll be false when the grass is green and the snow is white. So the exclusive sense says it's one or the other. It's either A or it's B, and it's not both. And it's not both. The inclusive sense maintains that it's one or the other, or it could be both. So the exclusive sense excludes this third possibility. It's false when the grass is green and the snow is white. But if we say the grass is green or the snow is white in the inclusive sense, then we will allow that statement will be true if this third situation comes up. The only situation in which it ends up being false is the situation in which the grass is neither green nor is the snow white. So for instance, when the grass is brown and the snow is yellow. So just to give you an idea of normal usages of these two different senses, you can imagine a case in which a parent says to a child, you can have ice cream or a candy bar. Now imagine the child goes, oh great, I'll go for both. I can have either ice cream or a candy bar. I'll have ice cream and a candy bar. So that would be this third case. Parent's not going to be up for that, right? Parent didn't mean to say that statement in the inclusive sense. The parent meant to say, you can get the ice cream or you can get the candy bar, but not both. Just one or the other, but not both of them. So now we can take a look at an inclusive example. So you can imagine that you get online to look for a job and you come across an advertisement that says that the candidate must be certified in C++ or have 2 years work experience using it. So either C++ or 2 years experience. And you go, oh, that's great. Turns out that I have certification in C++ and I have 2 years work experience. So that's great. And you go into the interview and the employer finds out that you're both certified and have 2 years work experience, that is, you have this third case obtained, the employer is not going to go, nope, we're not interested in that. We just wanted somebody who had one or the other, certification or the 2 years experience, not both of them. No, the employer is going to be ecstatic that not only do you have one or the other, but that you in fact have both of those things. That makes you an especially fit candidate for that job. So the job advertisement in this case is going to be used in the inclusive sense. So we needed to discuss the two different types of disjunctions because the validity of arguments can depend on whether we're talking about the exclusive sense or the inclusive sense of a disjunction. To show this, we can look at the following very simple argument. All right, P1, either A or B. P2 tells us it's A that happens, therefore not B. So remember that with the exclusive sense, that tells us either A but not B, or B but not A. Those are the only two conditions that make this true. Any other condition makes it false. So if P1 is true, then if we look at P2, it tells us that A is the one that actually happens, right? So it says, so we have either A or B. Premise 2 says it really is A that happened. So in the exclusive sense, if that's the sense that we're using in premise 1, that means B cannot have happened, which is what our conclusion states. So it's valid under the exclusive sense. It's going to end up being invalid on the inclusive sense. So let's look at why that's the case. So now we're going to give it the sense of being inclusive. We're giving premise 1 the sense of being the inclusive disjunction. So remember, that gives us 3 cases that make our premise true. It could be that A occurs but B doesn't. It could be the case that B occurs but A doesn't. But we have the third case in which A occurs or ends up being true and B ends up being true. B ends up occurring. So since we include this third case, we don't know. So notice we don't know which case takes place. But what's important is that this third case is a live option. And if it were the one to occur, then under the inclusive sense, our premise 1 ends up being true. A does in fact occur because it's both A and B. So premise 2 ends up being true. But since B occurs, not B has to be false. Because this says we don't get B, but this third option allows for B. So then we have all true premises but a false conclusion. And of course, by our definition of validity, a valid argument is one that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So by our definition of validity, this has got to be an invalid argument. It cannot be valid. And the reason why, so a further practical reason why you need to know that is standardly in logic, we interpret disjunctions in the inclusive sense only, unless stated explicitly otherwise. And there's a lot of students who want to give it the exclusive sense. Don't. For our purposes in this class, when you see a disjunction, if you're not told otherwise, you need to interpret it in this inclusive sense, which means that arguments that take this form, they'll be invalid. So if you have the following
argument, Topeka is the capital of Kansas or Springfield is the capital of Illinois. Topeka is the capital of Kansas, therefore Springfield is not the capital of Illinois. That is an invalid and therefore unsound argument. It's invalid because it takes precisely this form. T or S, T, therefore not S. Same structure as A or B, A, not B.